Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. Today I've got a guide that will hopefully help new players and old players alike in Age of Empires 2 for the next few years. This is going to be a complete guide on how to counter every single unit in Age of Empires 2, and I'm going to give you guys a ton of options and also lay out all the information I think is necessary on how to deal with every single unit. As we know, in Age of Empires, of course, there are a ton of different units and every single unit has its strengths and weaknesses, and in this case I'm going to show you guys a few options on how to deal with the unit classes in the game. And if you guys like this video, like, comment, subscribe, because if you get enough interaction, enough views on this video, I'm going to make a similar video but include all unique units. So in this video I'll do all units that are not unique units or team bonus units, and then in another video I can do unique units if you guys enjoy this one. But anyways, let's go ahead and start right in, and I'm going to be going in order as they appear in the tech tree, so starting with the archer and moving on from the range, etc., to the rest of the buildings. So starting things off, we've got the Archer-Line. Now for the Archer-Line, the best way to counter them is going to be the Skirmisher-Line. So in general, skirms beat archers, and that is the best way to deal with this line. So archer, crossbow, arbalest dies the skirms, and then elite skirm, and then imperial skirm for certain civs. In general, that is going to be the main counter. However, knights go 50-50 against archers usually, and siege like scorpions, mangonels, and bombard cannons do pretty well against the Archer-Line long term. Cavalry archers do okay long term, but really poorly in the short term. And pretty much anything else doesn't really do that well against the Archer-Line. Next up, we got the Skirm-Line. Skirm-Line dies usually to anything that is cavalry. So Scout Cav line, so Hussar, Knight Line, Steppe Lancers, Elephants. Anything that's cavalry that's not an archer does really well against skirms because you get to close the gap and the skirms don't get the attack bonus against you. Siege is also really good against skirms, but I would recommend Mangonels over Scorpions because Scorpions do pierce damage, which doesn't do as much for skirms. Mangonels do melee damage. A lot of people might not know that, so that is a nice little information tidbit. And in general, Mangonel-Line does great against skirmishers, especially in late game. Bombard Cannon does pretty well against them long term as well. But yeah, in general, I would say cavalry does very fine. In late game, you could go with infantry as well, especially with Gambesons. Champions should be solid against skirms, mainly cavalry and siege. Next up, we got the hand cannon. So for hand cannoneer, the best counter is going to be the arbalest or the skirms. Usually with ballistics, it will help a lot trying to hit these guys from long range. Hand cannon is really strong against infantry units for the most part, since they have the bonus damage against them. So to counter hand cannons, the best is to use range units, especially skirmishers getting the attack bonus, and archers just have enough fire speed and damage to take them out since the hand cannons are squishy. Siege is not great against hand cannons because onagers and scorpions die very fast to them, but bomber cannons are very long range, so bomber cannons can be solid against hand cannoneer. And I think siege rams do a good job of tanking all the damage from the hand cannons, since hand cannons do 1 damage and attack really slow, so siege ram can tank them pretty well. But of course you need something with a siege ram to kill the hand cannons, but in general I would say siege ram is a pretty good counter in a composition type scenario. Next up, we got the Cavalry Archer-Line, and the best counter to Cavalry Archer is going to be once again skirms. In this case, it's not like the Archer-Line where the Knights go 50-50. Knights and Light Cav do okay versus Cavalry Archers in early game, but in late game, Cavalry Archers tend to do much better, especially when they're heavily massed. So in low numbers, Cavalry is okay against Cav Archer, but in high numbers, Cav Archer is much better. So I would say skirm is your best friend against the Cavalry Archer, and I think that's like the best counter, but I think a secondary counter is going to be the Camels. Camels close the distance a lot faster than Knights and Light Cav, and they also have the attack bonus. So Camels are solid, but skirms is going to be your main answer. Siege, like siege onagers and heavy scorpions, are also really good in the late game. In early game, scorpions are better since scorpions can tank more damage. Scorpions have an extra pierce armor compared to mangonels, so the cav archers are only doing 1 damage to the scorpion, but they do 2 damage to the mangonels. So scorpions are much better against cav archers in early game. In late game, both scorpion line and siege onager do pretty well against cav archers. Next up, we got the Elephant Archer, and Elephant Archer is very weak to monks. Usually monks is the best counter against this unit. It has very low range, so getting it a conversion on it is great. It's also an expensive and slow unit, so monks do very well against those. A secondary counter would be skirmishers. Halberdier with rams, or halberdier if you can spare a lot of them, are a solid option in the late game. Camels are okay if you outnumber the Elephant Archers a lot, but not great if there's a big mass of Elephant Archers. Every other unit does pretty poorly against Elephant Archers if they're very well massed though, so I'd stick to skirms and monks, maybe some long range siege in late game like siege onager and bombard cannons, and then secondary counters like halberdiers is not too bad. Next up, we got the Swordsman-Line, so the Militia-Line, and this unit is really heavily countered by Arbalest and Hand Cannoneer. Arbalest just because they do, or like the Archer-Line in general, just because they move faster than infantry until Squires is kicked in at least, so early game archers are much better. And in late game, they have a good fire rate and good damage to take care of Swordsmen, and then Hand Cannoneer have a really solid base attack and also get an attack bonus against the Swordsman-Line. I'll also say Cavalry Archers are insane against Swordsmen and are easily a great counter against them, and then Knights tend to trade like 50-50 against Swordsman-Line, and Knights can also move faster, so they're a little bit better. So Swordsman-Line gets countered by a lot of things. Next up, we got the Spearman-Line or the Halberdier-Line, and this unit is also getting countered by a lot of things. So it gets countered by archers. The Archer-Line has an attack bonus against the Spear-Line. Not a lot of people know this, but they do. Skirmishers also have an attack bonus against the Halberdier-Line, so both those options are great at dealing with halbs or spears. And then halbs and spears are also dying to heavy siege. Siege onagers, heavy scorpions in late game do really well against them. Also, the infantry line, so the Militia-Line counters the Halberdier-Line. Yeah, militia is probably a secondary counter. It's really, really good, but I think the archers and skirms are actually the best counter to halberdier, and then I would say siege in late game is also quite solid. Next up, we got the Eagle Warrior. Eagle Warrior is countered by mainly the Swordsman-Line. That's the first best counter to Eagles, I would say. Knights go like 60-40 against Eagles, but the problem is Eagles can mix in Monks, which makes it hard for Knights to deal with them. But in a vacuum, Knights are pretty good against Eagles. Swordsmen are great against Eagles. The Archer-Line is okay against Eagles, but Eagles in big number usually win out. Hand Cannoneer are your next best option. So I think Hand Cannons, Swordsman-Line are your two best, and then Knights, if those other two options aren't working, is the best way to deal with Eagle Warriors. Next up, we're going to talk about the stable here. So we're going to talk about the Scout Cavalry line to start things off. And Scout Cav are interesting. I would say that the best counter to them is going to be the Halberdier overall. I think crossbows or the Archer line does really well against the Hussar line in most cases. But I would say it's like 50 or 60-40 for the archers. Hussar in late game can definitely be solid. Halbs destroy Hussars, so that's your best counter. I would say that the Knight line does really well against the Hussar line in general. So Knight line are camels. So Knights, camels, the secondary counter, main counter, Halberdier. Next up, we got the Knight line, and that's gonna die mainly to monks and halbs. Everything else does okay against knights, or most other things do okay against knights, but those two options are gonna be the best counter to knights. Archer line, as we talked about earlier, is 50-50. Elephant archer is good only if you mass it. Cavalry archer is good if you mass it. I wouldn't say it's a counter because it's expensive to get the cavalry archers. So as far as counters go, halbs number 1, monks number 2. That's the best way to deal with knights. In early game, monks number 1 though. So early monks number 1, secondary pikes, and later on it's gonna be halb number 1 and monks number 2. And then of course at all points I would say a secondary counter is going to be the camel. Camel does a good job countering the Knight line. Speaking of camel, we're going to be talking about how to counter the Camel-Line now. And the best counter to the camels is once again the Halberdier. Halberdier counters most things from the stable. So Halberdier and Monk is going to be the best answer to camels, but camels also die really hard to the Archer line. So that would be like the 3 main things to use against camels, and in all cases you'll be fine. Also, Heavy Scorpion is pretty decent against camels if you can get there in the late game, so that's also another solid choice. Next up, we got Battle Elephant. Hard dies to monks, hard dies to halbs as well. Camels is okay. I would say camel is a secondary counter to Battle Elephant. You have to outnumber the Battle Elephant quite heavily, but if you do, camels can do a good job taking them out. But otherwise, Battle Elephant dies really hard to halbs and monks, and they also die kind of hard to Heavy Scorpions in late game. So I would say another secondary counter is Heavy Scorpion in the late game. Next up, we got the Steppe Lancer. I would say for the primary counter of the Steppe Lancers, it's going to be Halberdier still. It's going to be the best counter in late game. In early game, it's going to be the Archer line that does the best against Steppe Lancer because they have low pierce armor. And I would say another secondary counter is going to be the Knight line and the Camel line, just because you have much better stats. Camels especially can kind of keep up with the mobility of the Steppe Lancer. And in general, halbs will do a really good job at all stages of the game. Monks is not a good counter to Steppe Lancer though, unless it's like super early game, because the Steppe Lancer can just one-shot the Knight if they have like 4 of them getting up close. So I wouldn't recommend monks against this unit. Next up, we're going to head over to the Siege Workshop now, and we're going to be talking about the Ram line to start things off. Ram line gets countered by pretty much everything that can attack it in melee, and I would say even villagers can do a good job against rams, but in general, I would say the best counters are going to be the Swordsman line and the Knight line, but even the Halberdier line is going to be pretty solid against rams. All range units do pretty poorly against rams because the ram has a lot of pierce armor, can soak up a lot of the ranged attacks. So I would say with rams, just stick to anything melee and you have a good time. Siege Onager is also a great counter. Same thing with the Siege Elephant, but Siege Elephant dies a lot harder to Halberdier, since Halberdier has an extra attack bonus against the Siege Elephant, and also Camels have a little bit more attack bonus against Siege Elephant. So those are the two units that do much better against Siege Elephants, but in general, any melee unit does really well versus Siege Elephants and Rams. One thing to note about Siege Elephants though, they usually do a lot of damage to villagers because they also benefit from attack upgrades from the blacksmith. So be careful about fighting Siege Elephants with villagers, but Rams die really hard to build. So those are the big differences between them. Next up, we got the Onager-Line. The best counters to Onager-Line is going to be Bombard Cannons and Monks. I would say in late game, Bombard Cannon and Monks will destroy the Onager-Line. And then in early game, like let's say Castle Age, best way to counter Mangonels and early imp Onagers is actually to go for Cavalry. So Light Cav and Knights do a great job of sniping these. And I would say that those two options, so either Cavalry or Monk Bombard Cannon, are the best ways to deal with Onagers. Next up, we got the Scorpion-Line. In early game, best thing again is going to be Cavalry. So Light Cav Knights will do best against Scorpions. And then in late game, you actually have 3 tools to counter Scorpions. It's Monks number 1, Bombard Cannon number 2, and Siege Onager number 3. All of those 3 options actually do very well against Scorpions. So anyone you choose will be a very solid choice. Next up, we got the Siege Tower. Literally anything it counters this unit. It doesn't even work properly at the moment. It's terrible. It's literally so bad. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, by the way. That's all I have to say with the Siege Tower. Next up, we got the Bombard Cannon. Bombard Cannon is usually weak to Cavalry as well. So Light Cav Line and Knight Line does pretty well against Bombard Cannon. However, I would think Monks with Redemption is a great tool in the late game. And I would say a really weird scenario, but Trebs are also really good against Bombard Cannons. If you can hit a shot on the Bombard Cannon, you one-shot it. So although Trebs are a bit awkward to use, you have more range than Bombard Cannon. So if you can just shoot them from long range, maybe under your castles, Trebuchets can get some nasty shots on the Bombard Cannon and destroy them. So Cavalry number 1, Monks number 2, Trebs is a secondary counter in some weird scenarios. But truly, anything that gets up close to the Bombard Cannon can do damage to it. So I would say with Bombard Cannon, it's more about closing the gap, because even like Arbalest and Heavy CA, if you close the gap on the Bombard Cannon, can easily kill it. Next up, we have the Petard. This dies mainly to range units. I mean, everything kills the Petard, but if he's gonna like try to Petard your castle, the best defense against that is like the Arbalest line. Cavalry Archer-Line is also pretty good, but no one's really having any trouble dealing with Petards. You can also make like a wall around your castles, so just a wall the base to the castle to defend against Petards. It's also pretty cool. But again, no one's having trouble dealing with this unit. It's very niche to use. And next up, we have got the Monastery, so we're going to talk about the Monk real quick. Monk dies really hard to Light Cav. It's actually the best counter. Other good counters against the Monk is going to be the Arbalest line and the Cavalry Archer-Line. I think those two options are pretty solid. I think Skirms and Big Mass can also be solid against Monks. But in general, Monks are really solid in early game and weaker as the game goes on. My best recommendation, though, is of course the Light Cav. It's by far the best counter. Eagle Warrior is also pretty good for the Mesoamerican civs. Next up, we got the dock. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the dock really quickly here because it's a bit weird. It works much different than land units. So for the dock, it works in a rock, paper, scissors format. Fire Galley beats Galley, which beats Demo, which beats Fires. It's a rock, paper, scissors, kind of like the recycling symbol. That's how it works in theory. But in practice, I got to give you guys the real information now. In practice, Galleys actually beat the other two if they're massed and if you have a big body of water to work with. If you're able to micro Galleys, you beat Fire Galleys and Demolition ships very easily. However, upgrade advantages are key. So if they get fire ships while you're still on galley, it's going to be difficult. And if you have galleon, for example, and they're still on fire ships, you're going to destroy them. So whoever has upgrades is important. But in general, large body of water, galleys are the best. In small ponds like 4 lakes or something like that, then fire galley and demo are going to be much better than just pure galleys. Also, if you do go for galleys, usually you just go pure galleys. Don't mix in any fires except in certain situations. But you really have to mass the galleys up to get the desired effect. And then talking quickly about cannon galleons and dromons. Basically, cannon galleons die hard to everything that can reach them. So if you can reach them with fast fires, great. If you can't get to them with fast fires, go galleons. If you can run them in with demos, that's also great. And then dromons, the same thing, but dromons do a bit better versus galleons. And also cannon galleons and dromons are usually used to siege buildings. So they're usually quite weak against ships, but dromons are a little bit better against galleons than cannon galleons. So that's a nice tidbit. And the last thing I'll say about the dock is the demolition ship in Castle Age onwards is really OP. So like that's really solid. It's really amazing against fires. And if you can close the gap on galleons in late game with heavy demo, it's still really good. So you can just run 20 demos into the galleons. You'll lose like 5, but then you'll get some really good shots in and it's usually worth it. So definitely demo kind of breaks the rock, paper, scissors in late game, but that's kind of all the secrets of the dock counters there. All right, that's gonna be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video can be very useful to pretty much everyone that plays this game. And what I'd like to ask from you guys is to share this video on maybe Reddit, on anyone who's looking for a guide on how to counter units in this game. Linked in this video because I put a lot of effort into it, and I think that my information is better than what's out there right now. So when it comes to information in general, like all topics, I feel like when you research online, you don't really get information necessarily that's from a good source. So I made sure that this one had solid information, and I packed it with everything that people need to know. So please share it to people who are new to the game and who want to learn more about how to deal with every unit in the game. And I think this is going to be a comprehensive guide and something that satisfies everyone. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.